get started. So welcome everybody for coming to this event tonight. I'm very happy to have Brian Corr here from NACOLE, which is the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And we're hoping to have a really good mini information session and Q&A on how we can start to work much more effectively towards creating a civilian oversight board or commission in Dearborn, and what that might look like for us as opposed to maybe what it does look like in other cities and whatnot. So I will just read off a little bit beforehand. So before we start the presentation, before I introduce Brian, I'm going to read off a couple things that we usually say at the beginning of every meeting. These are things that we call non-negotiables that we like to take into the meeting with us and are not up for debate. So the first one is that racism exists. The second is that lived experiences are valid. Third, we look at impact as opposed to intent when we're talking about the things that we say and the things that we are doing. Fourth, we believe that you can be both the oppressor and the oppressed, and social barriers are human made, and that's the last one. So just some very brief housekeeping. This presentation is obviously being recorded, so you can keep your cameras off or change your name or anything, but you can also hop on with us and we'll hopefully have a good Q&A at the end. And we would love to see you there. And by then we'll stop the live stream so you can have a bit more privacy in that way. We're going to try to use the chat and the raise hand features if you can do that. And I guess I'll just keep on paying attention who's going in order. And then the last thing is that we like to critique ideas and not people. So I'm hoping we have a really good night tonight. And now I'm going to take a second to introduce Brian. So Brian Corr is the immediate past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. He currently works for the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he's the executive director of the Cambridge Peace Commission and executive secretary of the Police Review and Advisory Board. So from what our mutual connection at NACOLE said, they were born and raised in Detroit. And so please correct me if I just got this from her email. And we're really happy to have you here because I know that you're probably very familiar with Michigan, Detroit, Dearborn area. And so hopefully this is gonna be a really great insight to hear from you. The last thing, I want to point out that he was very active when you were at University of Michigan, and you've been a part of some groups, and I believe I found this on LinkedIn, that I think are really tremendous. ACLU, Jobs with Justice, to Technology for Social Change. And I guess you can talk a little bit more about yourself too if you want. I'm not going to be the Brian expert, but you got it.
That's okay. All right, well, thank you so much. And really, I just want to thank you all for having me here for this presentation. I will say that I have, like 5 hours worth of content, so I'm going to do my best to get through what I can in a reasonable amount of time so we can really have some discussion and questions. And let me just say a little bit about me and then a little bit about NACOLE briefly. But so, as Gina said, I am originally from Detroit, was born and raised, went to Cass Tech for any other Cass technicians around, because I know we're all that way. And I went to the University of Michigan long ago. I'll put it this way. No, I was going to say I can't be right. Yeah, my 40th high school reunion from Cass Tech is coming up next year, so I'll just say that. So I've been doing this work for a while, and I definitely come to it both as an activist, as a peace activist. That's really the origin of my work, but also as someone that grew up in Detroit really in the 1970s. My first job out of college, I was a door-to-door canvasser for a group called Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and I was in Ann Arbor still, so we canvassed suburban Detroit, and I definitely had some interesting experiences in Dearborn. Certainly remember the Dearborn of my childhood, of Orville Hubbard and Camp Dearborn and public parks for residents only. I mean, that wasn't just Dearborn, that was a lot of suburbs of Detroit at the time. But, definitely my early impressions of Dearborn are still with me, and I'm also aware of how much Dearborn has changed. And I'll just say that the diversity in Dearborn is something quite different from when I was growing up, and yet we still see today very few African Americans in the city of Dearborn, Michigan, despite its proximity to Detroit and everything else. So there's a complicated history, and I want to just share on a personal note. I'm going to eat into my presentation time, but I'm not sure if any of you remember in 2016, there was a woman from Detroit named Janet Wilson. She had gotten at some sort of fracas at Fairlane Mall. She was someone dealing with mental health challenges, and she was sort of chased down by the police and killed on Michigan Avenue. Her family later won a lawsuit, and she is my cousin. Her mother is my mother's second cousin, and they grew up not together, but knowing each other. My mother is still in touch. And so just to say that as you hear me talk about principles and law enforcement and all of this, and know that this is also personal for me, right? Right here, or where you are in Dearborn, my cousin was killed by the police. So it's something that has touched very many of us. So I just want to put that on the table. And having said that, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. This is, you never quite know what you're going to get, but I think I've got it. Okay, so hopefully you can see a PowerPoint presentation. Very exciting. Okay, so
I can see that.
okay, and I switched the slide, and that worked hopefully. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. So this is the thing where I can't see everything at the same time. So I guess I'm going to run through this quickly.
It looks good.
Okay, thank you. I always want to start by talking a little bit about the history of policing, because we have these competing narratives in the United States. We have one narrative that's built on this kind of standard idea of policing just sort of evolved from the town watch and the, people on horseback patrolling gently, and it's just like England, little villages. And that was the traditional story. And then we also are more aware today of the important piece of history that a huge part of the history of policing, although not the only part, is the history of slave patrols. I won't read this in the interest of time, but here's a copy of a slave patroller's oath from North Carolina, just about 200 years ago. And these were people who were pulled in from the community to search for slaves, search for weapons, and keep them down, keep them unempowered, keep them enslaved. And the other narrative, which you'll see is really from the same period, is Sir Robert Peel, who was the minister responsible for policing in England in the 1820s. He later became prime minister. And there are many quotes from his principles, but this is the seventh principle that you'll hear very often just stated as the police are the public and the public are the police. But this is the tradition that most police officers, most law enforcement are taught, that we are really we are members of the community. We're given this special obligation, but we're really part of the community. And you will see that often individual officers, departments don't always remember this, but this is what policing experts will kind of come back to, that we really are members of the community. And so in light of what we're here to talk about today, civilian oversight, I would say that some form of civilian oversight, as it says on the slide, is important. Now, some people would define that as we have a mayor, we have a city council, we elect them, they're in charge. I would say it's something that needs to be closer. It needs to be outside of the police department, but within government, so that you actually have the ability to make change. Every community should figure out what works for that community. It's just part of why I appreciate all of you here in Dearborn inviting me to be part of this thinking and conversation. And finally, I'll just say quickly that it's never enough. You'll hear a lot about oversight has failed, oversight doesn't work, look at this situation. And what I would say is that oversight has a certain limited role. It's an important role, but it's not everything. And often when people say oversight has failed, what they're really saying it has failed to meet expectations. So I'll say a little bit more about that, but it's important that expectations of oversight are set from the front end, so people know what the oversight agency can do, what it can't do, what its powers are, and really helping people to understand what's possible and what's not from the beginning. So a tiny bit about civilian oversight history. Without going to various stories, it generally has been reactive. I mean, oversight goes back to really in the current form, the 70s, and there were attempts to create oversight as early as 1920s. But it generally, until the last few years, has been reactive. Something terrible happens, or a series of terrible events in a community, and people organize, people say, we have to do something about this. It may be people in the city council or in the government, or it may just be activists or some combination. It might even be the family of someone who has lost someone, or even someone who's just been a victim of violence and it wasn't fatal. But the tendency is to then hold the police accountable, sort of create a system that parallels the criminal legal system, so that there's almost like a trial. You've got people presenting cases and evidence and all of that. And the idea is that if we hold people accountable for misconduct, then they'll stop doing it because they only do it because they think they can get away with it. Sometimes that's true. So many times it's much more complicated, may have nothing to do with that. So over time, civilian oversight has evolved into being much more proactive. I won't read through the whole slide, but really looking at how do you have front-end accountability? How do you create systems? How do you create rules? How do you create training? How do you hire officers? How do you hold them accountable in a way that promotes accountability on the front end, and that you get the kind of policing and public safety that your community wants, as opposed to when something goes wrong, holding people accountable. So that's kind of the general framework. And I'm looking, I have way too much here. So I'm going to kind of breeze through some of this. So civilian oversight here in our country, as it does exist in many other countries, it's basically, we define it as anything that will investigate, audit, review, investigations, or can actually do those investigations themselves. It could be citizen complaints, use of force incidents, other issues. They will do some sort of monitoring of policies and procedures. They may or may not be able to weigh in on them officially. And for us, it includes any agency that has people who are not part of law enforcement, who are not sworn officers. You'll see that, well, you won't see because I can't show you everything, but as you look across the country, there are many different ways of doing this. Some places insist that you have to have former police officers who are part of investigations who understand it. Others will say you must not have police officers because they will be biased, and everything in between. So there are many different ways that you can organize civilian oversight. Again, I have a lot to say. This is often what people want to know, which is what are the different models and how do they work and what's the best model? And one thing I always emphasize, and we at NACOLE emphasize, is there is no best model. There are not best practices. There really is only what's effective in your local context. But these are, and I'll say a little bit more about that too. So the basic models are the top three: a review-focused model, an investigation-focused model, and the monitor, auditor, inspector general has various names, but it's really like kind of what the name says, an inspector general who is doing broader systemic things. But let me just say very quickly about each model. So with the review-focused model, and that's what you've traditionally saw, is that the police department investigates complaints and misconduct, and then a board of residents appointed in whatever way reviews those, may make recommendations, may even make rulings, but they're really reviewing investigations done by the law enforcement agency. It certainly is better than not having any form of oversight by a huge amount. As it says in the slide, and I'll make these available to accountability for Dearborn. I should just say that, so people don't have to worry about trying to copy things down or review the recording later. But it does bring the community into the process, into having input. It helps community members through the board and more broadly to understand what's happening and to help build public trust. And it can really help to give the police department some different perspectives, because police departments are all different, police leaders are all different, but many do want to have the community feel good about policing. And one way to do that is to know what the community thinks and wants. And I say that very broadly, all aspects. Okay, too long on review. So investigation focused model, this is what often people are looking for. People feel that, well, we have to be able to investigate, we need to have subpoenas, we need to get in there and find out the truth and then hold people accountable. It can be very important, and it is, especially in larger departments, It's usually pretty viable because you'll have enough complaints that you can do a number of investigations, hire and train investigative staff, and it doesn't rely on the police department. You still will need cooperation, but having civilian-led investigations is often something that will make the community generally feel better, though not knowing that it's someone outside the police department. And then the third model, not that this is some order of good or bad, but is this auditor, monitor, inspector general. Generally, the reporting is stronger because they're really doing systemic reviews. So they're looking at, are there patterns? And it may be patterns in complaints. It could be patterns in other things. It could be a report on how protests were policed, and separate from complaints, but just looking at the tactics, looking at the strategy, looking at whatever weapons, less lethal or not, were being used. And it ultimately can provide a bigger type of change for a department, because again, it's not just looking at what this officer did in this case, but at systemic issues. And the final thing is just hybrid models. That's where it says, really, over time, more and more communities are saying, well, we like this aspect of the investigative model, but we also really want to be able to do these systemic reviews and audits. So we're going to create something that has some of both. And again, it partly depends on your local ordinances, your state laws, the history of your community, the needs. So there's a lot of things that go into that. Okay, so as usual, I am spending too much time on each slide, so I'm going to breeze through some of these again. Since this is stuff I tend to say more for, say, when people are actually in the process of creating an oversight board or there's an ordinance that's being looked at, but I will just say that it's very important for oversight to have credibility. You can imagine, those of you who may not have had any experience with it, there's a lot of skepticism from many quarters. There's skepticism from community members often that what's this really going to be able to do? There's skepticism from law enforcement. There can be skepticism from elected officials. And so it's important that oversight staff and board members, or commission members, whatever the form is, really work to establish credibility. They need to be fair, impartial, objective, even while remembering we're here. So I shared the story about my cousin, Janet Wilson. I mean, that obviously is part of who I am. And at the same time, when I'm looking at any individual case, I have to be fair and impartial, even while I bring my own lived experience to the work. So again, I'm going to quickly breeze through here. So some of the key things that you need to get training on if you're a board or commission member: policies and procedures, understanding how oversight works, knowing what authority and responsibilities you have and don't have. And training is something that needs to happen early and often. Continuing education is really important in our work. Again, this is just a slide that goes into details of why that is. Also, if you have an oversight agency with staff, which generally there's some form of staffing, it very much helps. It's hard to do it as all volunteers. And there are places, generally small communities, where they do have an all volunteer oversight agency in terms of staffing and the board members. But staff also need to get lots of training. And one of the things that NACOLE does, I haven't said much about NACOLE, but is as the national association that supports and promotes civilian oversight, we have an annual training conference, which is in person. This year, we're doing a hybrid with an in-person and virtual component. The virtual is online over the course of a number of weeks in the fall. In person will be in Tucson in December. And for people who work in oversight, it's so important, both for the training, but also for the support. Moving on quickly, the next slide, ethics and professional standards. I won't go into this, but I'll just say again, these are all very important for the work to be taken seriously by everybody. It's not just kind of how you feel about it, but it really is a professional field. And there's, as I said, there's training and resources available for people who do that work. Next, very briefly, I'm going to do a few little quick things here. What happens when the police follow the rules, but this is what lawful but awful, as it says on the slide. But this is an important thing, because often when we think about oversight, police accountability, and misconduct, we think about very big things. We think about use of force, police-involved shootings, things like that. But so often there are issues where it's really about conduct. The officer was a jerk. The officer was rude to me. I didn't think the officer had any respect for me. I think the officer was racist. And those are types of things that are often harder to investigate because they're not quite as fact-based in a sense, but they also are a big part of what determine the tone, how people in the community feel about the police department, how they tell their friends to feel about the police department. And so much of this is really about perception and feeling. So when there's no violation of policy, maybe the officer followed all the rules, but the outcome was not what you want. Then you need to look at this idea again, front-end accountability. How do we change how we train police officers so that they police, so that they patrol the streets, so that they interact with residents and community members and people visiting your community in a way that you want and expect. And there's this whole concept of procedural justice, which I would love to talk about. I'm going to have to skip through it in the next few slides. But it's basically, it was highlighted in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing that came out under President Obama. It's become a concept in lots of police training. And it's also something that is very important in training for oversight and the world of oversight. You know, building trust and legitimacy. And part of that is this idea of procedural justice. So again, people can Google it. You know, there's people who are experts in it. But where it's really been developed is at Yale Law School. Tracy Mears, who was on the President's Task Force, who I think at the time was the deputy dean of Yale Law School, and another professor, Tom Tyler, have worked on these concepts for many years. It's not only about law enforcement, but about government and other institutions in general. So having voice, feeling that the people you're dealing with are neutral and trustworthy, that the quality of treatment, that the interaction feels respectful and that you're conferred dignity, and that you trust the people. So getting closer to the end here, take too long, as I keep saying. So wrapping up the piece around oversight, it is to the extent that you form any kind of oversight in Dearborn, just remember that it's important that people see it as professional, that people trust the people doing it, that people think they're doing it for the right reasons, and that they continue to get the right training. And you know, ultimately, I'll just say, is civilian oversight the answer? Absolutely not. But as it says right here, without it, it's really hard to gain legitimacy in many communities. Now, I will say, there are about 18,000 law enforcement agencies and about 200 oversight agencies, but most major cities have civilian oversight. Of the 10 largest cities, Phoenix is the only one that doesn't have some form of oversight, and they're working on it. It's Arizona, it's been very contentious, and the state legislature is trying to block it. But I think sooner or later, Phoenix will have oversight, just like Tucson does. So it's not the only thing, but it really is a very important part. So I think I've probably used up a good 15, 20 minutes, which I promised. So you're going to see me skip through a whole bunch of slides. And I will just, so I'm going to jump to this. As I said, these are not the best practices, but these are 13 principles of effective civilian oversight. I won't read through them all. Again, they'll be available. They're on the NACOLE website. But I will say, importantly, that these are not the 13 must-haves. These are 13 general principles that we've extracted from a 2-year study. That's some of the slides I skipped over, funded by the Department of Justice under the Obama administration in the closing days. And it allowed us to come up with these 13 principles. And what we always say is that not every civilian oversight agency will be able to act on all of these. So as you're looking at those, you have to really figure out what effective practices will work for you based on the size of your community, the history, the type of policing, law enforcement, public safety. What model is the best fit? What is it, a hybrid? Is it this? Is it that? Looking at those 13 effective practices, again, recognizing that not all of them will exist for any particular agency. Will it strengthen your oversight work in relation to these general principles? And what are the unintended consequences of some of them? So not everything will be a fit for your local context. Not everything will be politically achievable. And so you have to figure out what you can do. And so as I close this part, I always like to end on this. Yeah, I just love this because this image, as some of you may be able to see, if you have really good screen detail. It says nothing about us without us is for us. And it's based on a slogan that was popularized by disability rights and youth activists in South Africa. And so it has spread. Lots of aspects of the disability rights movement use it. And I always think that it's a good grounding piece because it really is about all of us, the entire community. And I like to pair this up. Oh, I would say this is by Ricardo Levins Morales. If you like this art, he's got a website. He's a very good artist and lots of political stuff for those who like that. And then this quote, you may have seen this before. If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I will say this is often attributed to someone named Lilla Watson, who was an Aboriginal rights activist in Queensland, Australia. But she will tell you that this was not hers. This was what that community of activists, this was their slogan. And we in the Western world like to assign things to brilliant people and say it's their brilliant idea, but this really came from her community. So for me, it always reminds me of, for all of us in this work, whatever our background, that our liberation is bound up with the liberation of everyone. So with that, quickly flash up my contact information. You can find me. And with that, I will stop. I'm going to try to stop sharing. Okay, and we are back to the normal screen. So hopefully that was helpful. It was really fast, but I just wanted to at least cover some of these key points and know now we have a chance for a conversation or questions or statements and answer.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that too, because I think there might be a range of comments after this. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for that presentation. And I mean, the end slides are very beautiful. Thank you for sharing them. And also, I feel very grateful for this connection. I'll stop talking, but I'll start off maybe with a couple. Yeah, I'll start off with a couple questions that we had. So I think that there might be some questions potentially dropping in from Facebook, but I still wanted to keep all of your interactions for other participants as private as we can. But so I'll just start off really quick. If you guys want to jump in, go ahead. But the first question I wanted to ask is, what are the benefits and drawbacks of having a designated civilian oversight commission versus having the existing governing bodies, so someone like a city council or the mayor, fulfill the roles that the civilian oversight commission would likely fulfill?
Okay, that is a great question. Wow, I feel like I should have written that and sent it to you. So this actually comes up quite a bit. And I would say the main difference is proximity and specialization and knowledge, right? So yes, a mayor, a city council, ultimately they have oversight of everything that happens in a community. But when you're looking at the work of policing and law enforcement, there's so much detail. There's so much to know about training, about procedures, about policy. There's really being able to connect with other people that do the work of civilian oversight to be able to assess whether it's individual complaints or broader systemic issues. And ultimately, yes, the mayor, and they would say even the police chief, they have to be responsible. The city council has to pass ordinances, but to be able to look at the day-to-day or even month-to-month operations of a law enforcement agency, you need to have people that have more of a specific focus, but also have the specialized training to understand the work and to be able to then judge things within that context.
That was great. So this is just a very specific question, but I think in our community, we've had city council members, for example, they've suggested that, the power of investigation, the subpoena power lies within the council. So in terms of just technical implementation of having, different roles, what do you, I guess my question was going to be, can it be possible that different departments have similar powers? So even if the Oversight Commission has a certain power, this is something that can also be fulfilled in other ways too?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess in the abstract, of course, for example, this is much more typical. There are many places where you can make a complaint to the police department or a complaint to the Civilian Oversight Agency. I mean, pretty much every place you can complain to the police department. You can imagine there's some barriers for many people in taking that approach. So you could, I mean, you could certainly have the ability for the oversight agency to do investigations, and separately you could have, say, the city council. It would be sort of unusual because, again, I think that the city council has so many different pieces of work that I guess they could, you know, they could sort of say that an investigation could happen. They could ask the law department to do it, but I would think that that would be sort of a special case. Whereas when you have a civilian oversight agency, I mean, their day-to-day job is to be doing this work. So you know, I guess on some level, you can kind of create anything you want that works within your ordinance and the state law in Michigan. I guess it's a question of, you know, how would that actually function in a way to provide civilian oversight on the day-to-day basis that I think most people would be looking for, as opposed to if there's a big issue, the city council could come in and do a special investigation. That certainly could happen. Well, I mean, we certainly, NACOLE has not come out and said we should defund the police. You know, I'd say within our membership, because we are an association of people that do civilian oversight work, there are certainly people who are involved in our work, whether they're board members or staff or people that say are involved in monitoring consent decrees in different departments, who are all over the map. So I can think of a whole bunch of people who are within NACOLE who think that, yes, we need to defund the police, and a couple who would even say we need to abolish the police. I'd say the vast majority of people in NACOLE, I mean, we do this work and we're part of the governmental system. And I think we tend to believe in reform and accountability, that reform is possible. So to the extent that, you know, defunding means reallocating, it's all the same things everybody says. You know, there's different ways to do it. There's some departments that, say, for example, where I am in Cambridge, we have a department that has a whole unit that includes clinical social workers and clinical psychologists. It manages them. Most departments don't have that. So, I mean, it means different things in different places. And I guess to the bigger issue you raised, you know, right, defund means various things to various people. People who don't want to see sort of external reform and accountability efforts will often say that it's just all part of defunding the police and it's illegitimate. I think ultimately for me, I tell people about what it is that I believe in and how I believe that you know, this idea of the police are the community and the community are the police. We all have to work together. And but yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that you're not always going to win, as it were. Some people are just going to say, no, I don't care. What you want to do is wrong. And it's going to get officers killed and it's bad. But for people who are trying to figure it out, I think it's important to be able to explain not so much the slogan, but what it is you want, what's your vision, and how you see what you want to do actually creating better public safety. But you have to do it in a somewhat holistic way. And so it can be complicated. Right. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And, you know, again, I'm a Detroiter, I'm very strong union advocate. And I totally hear you that, I mean, public safety unions and especially police unions are a different animal in many places, especially you've got the National Federation of Police. They tend to be very loud spokespeople for the Back the Blue movement and all of that. You know, and again, I totally support the right of everybody to organize and bargain collectively. Now, as you point out, there are a lot of differences in police unions and the way things work. And I guess ultimately, there's no magic answer. You know, part of it is that political pressure. It's got to be something where it's more valuable for elected officials to have the support of the other people than just the support of the police union. And it's also, though, something that I think really where it comes down to is the union contracts. Now, again, you know, nobody is all powerful, mayors, anybody else. But when those contracts are negotiated, often, you know, just around the country, they will be going on, and the negotiations go on and on. But in the end, you know, they've been given this ability to push for extra things because they don't go on strike. And there's actually a very interesting history. I think it was in the New York Times, just came out recently about how the history of police unions actually goes back to Detroit in particular and the early 70s, and how the Detroit Police Department in the wake of, again, stuff that was happening when I was a little kid. The stress unit, where I think it was 22 out of 24 men who were killed by that unit were Black men. It was supposed to be creating safe streets after the uprising in 1967. And so civilian oversight was imposed. And then part of the negotiation was, well, we need to have more union protections, and, you know, we've got to keep the city safe, and we don't have stress anymore. And so it's, you know, it's been a long journey to get there. But I think ultimately what it's going to take is cities negotiating much more toughly. Tougher, more tough. Yes, I went to Cass Tech, and I can use the word toughly. That there's, because there's not really, it's really a political issue ultimately. Organizing can help, but it's going to take the people who are in those rooms negotiating those contracts to not accept provisions about binding arbitration for, you know, police misconduct and things like that. There really has to be more of a balance. So anyway, I'm going on and on. So that's a really hard question to answer. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I said we did this 2-year study about what works in oversight. We studied 9 cities with oversight with different models, hybrid and inspector general and all of that. And so the report is basically done. We're waiting for the current administration to kind of sequence it and release it. So we'll have more information, but it's one of the things is that it's very, so you can look generally at the impact on oversight, but because there have been so few oversight agencies, it's really hard to draw like a line between, oh, when you have this type of oversight, it does this. So, you know, I guess what I'd say anecdotally, there's a lot of conversation or a lot of things that people talk about how it's made a difference, but trying to compare, it's been, and again, people have tried this. Policing people have also tried this too. I know the International Association of Chiefs of Police was just looking at this, and it's really hard to, I just basically say, you can't really say that if we have oversight, it's going to do this. It's going to reduce police killings by 20%. It's going to reduce use of force by 15%. And I've seen people who've done research to try to make that case, and it just hasn't really held up. So I would love to be able to tell you that, yes, we have this definite evidence. And, you know, we may 2 or 3 years from now, we're working on another research project, but it's a really hard thing, again, just because there's so little oversight compared to the number of police departments, and every oversight agency is different and they have different powers and authority. So I'm sorry, it was a long-winded way of saying not really, you know. So I'd say that in general, yes, it's another thing that is it's a deterrent, it's a risk management tool, but, you know, a little bit in the abstract. And so the cost of oversight, and I'm trying to answer 3 things at the same time. In terms of the actual cost, I mean, most, you know, the oversight agency isn't going to be that expensive compared to the police department. And in fact, one of the things that people have been doing in a lot of places, including putting in charters and other things, is saying that the civilian oversight agency's budget should be pegged at 1% of the police department's budget, because that should be adequate. And places have fought for that. And even New York City, which they just redid their charter a couple of years ago, they didn't have a specific number, but they pegged it at 0.65% of the police department budget. And that actually increased the agency's budget by about 35–40%. And that was necessary because when New York City adopted body-worn cameras, they had so much more work to do. So the cost of actually the establishment of oversight, you know, for staffing and training, it's minimal. And so again, in the kind of general way, I would say that, you know, if you are even reducing misconduct by a small amount through oversight and through accountability and through retraining and changing policies and procedures, you are likely to then reduce the amount of lawsuits that you're facing and settlements that you have to give out. But again, I can't give you a number or a percentage. So
yeah, that was a great answer. I think that was one of the questions that we had gotten beforehand too. This is, I have another one that's kind of interesting. This came in from somebody a couple weeks ago when they submitted it, but she was asking, is there absolutely any way that we can allocate funding towards having mental health professionals or people properly trained in de-escalation? I guess I'm assuming she's asking through this commission, and how that might look.
You know, that would be interesting. I don't know of anyone who's done it in that way. You know, there, as you know, there are people all over the country, right here in Cambridge. I mean, looking at those sorts of things. And as I was saying, I mean, we actually in Cambridge have inside the department, we've got 2 full-time social workers and a clinical psychologist that just work with at-risk people. I mean, there's a separate social worker who works in the domestic violence unit. So, I mean, it's sort of traditional. It's more than most departments do, and they do it pretty well, but it's still, you know, not the same as having those services in the community, having a robust set of mental health services, of services for people who are experiencing homelessness, all the other issues that you deal with in an urban environment, as well as just things that come up with families and all that. So having said that, I think that you know, there's so many different ways to do that. You could do it through your civilian oversight agency. I mean, let's say, you know, this is kind of down the road a bit. Let's say you have a civilian oversight agency and they have the ability to look at policies and procedures and make recommendations. They could do a whole study, bring people in, make recommendations about that. In most places, what I've seen, again, including Cambridge, is special task forces have been created that are, you know, intended to be more broadly representative of different parts of the community and different perspectives. And it's sort of like a blue ribbon commission or a task group or something that's put in place to do that. But again, if you had an existing oversight agency, they could certainly do that. And it could be part of, you know, a broader proposal that looking at providing public safety that really meets the needs of our community. We want there to be oversight of the law enforcement agency, but we also are asking that there are other possibilities. You know, and certainly this is what communities like ours in Cambridge are facing, that it gets pretty complicated when you start getting into exactly how you do that. Everyone in the country is talking about the CAHOOTS model in Oregon, which is a good model. And that model evolved organically over 50 years. It really started in the late 60s with people freaking out at rock concerts and realizing that recognizing that the police were not the best way to come in and deal with somebody who was, you know, having a hallucinogenic episode and freaking out. And over the years, it evolved into what it is today. So anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of different ways to do it. It's not necessarily, you know, it may not be the most direct way considering the situation that Dearborn is in, but an oversight agency could do it. Like I said, I think that having a package of reforms that promote enhanced public safety for all members of the community could include something like that probably more easily. Yeah, well, there's a couple things. So I'm gonna just off the top of my head, but I guess it's a little, yes and no is what I would say. I mean, I think that in some ways it can be a selling point, but I mean, my experience working with police over these many years, and I never thought I would be someone who's like, I think I know how to work with police pretty well, but I feel like I do at this point. And part of it is that it's largely about the approach. So one thing I often say to people is that, you know, I think for your average kind of community member, especially community activists, it's hard to get inside the police mindset of, you know, again, this is just the reality, whether we think it's justified or how could they think this, but most police feel unheard. They feel like they go out into dangerous situations that no one else does. They're willing to take on everything. They've been asked to do everything. Society doesn't give them tools they need. In fact, every time something terrible happens across the country, they all think it's every single cop. So, I mean, you know, again, you can critique that, but there's a lot of that that's just kind of in the police thinking. So when activists who've been talking about, again, maybe undifferentiated to someone, defund, abolish, reform, it's all kind of the same thing. It's a bunch of people who hate cops coming after us. And so you say, oh, well, yeah, we hate cops, but we think that we agree with you on not wanting to do that. It's just, it doesn't get heard. So I think that the way to do it is to like find out in your specific community, like what do the police think? And not just the leadership, and it's often hard to get, but if you can get some rank and file officers and just whether it's a formal thing or talking with them, find out what they think about those things. Because I can tell you in Cambridge, there's a whole conversation about taking that stuff out of the police department when the feeling in the department is, well, we were asked to do this, and we're so proud because we are one of the handful of cities in the country that's really taken this on, and we've got the training, and we have specialized officers, and blah, 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 blah. So they're not real interested in hearing about taking that out of the police department, whether they should be or not. So I think that, again, it's like a long-winded thing, but I think that to the extent that it's less about telling them, we've heard that police don't want to do this, and we agree, let's take it from you and we can use that money for something else. They're not going to hear it. But if there's something that, there's some approach that says, we've heard this, what do you think about this? Are there things that you think really could be done outside the police department if the city actually funded it? And I think that there's a lot of those things that could be. I mean, there probably for the foreseeable future will be a need for the kind of armed first responder. Hopefully we as a society can get to a point where that's not what we need, and there are different ways to resolve conflicts, and the social issues that we have don't drive people to criminal behavior, and multi-generational trauma diminishes over time. But there's a lot of issues, and so that's kind of the police framework is we're here to deal with everything. So if it's seen as, what's that same thing like that last slide, if we're here because our liberation is tied up with yours, that's great. If we're saying, hey, we're going to free you from this thing, just agree to these 3 easy steps. I know I'm exaggerating, but I think that is, to the extent that you want to do that kind of collaborative approach, I think that is how you would get police officers on board with that kind of thinking. And it's not always easy, and it's not always possible, and it's not all officers, but there are officers who are of goodwill, who want to do the right thing and may get jaded, but would love to see a way to have the mental health system take care of mental health issues and find other people who could respond to quality of life issues that didn't involve violence or the threat of violence. So, okay, I was, again, too long.
I'm good to hear you talk all night, but in the interest of time, I know that we had talked about wanting to keep it to about an hour, but I did want to leave a little bit of space if anybody last minute wanted to hop on. But first, I want to thank you, Brian, for your time.
You're welcome.
This has been a great conversation so far, and Mary Jo, if you want to. Oh well, I'm sorry, Brian. I could hear you talking. I didn't see.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, anything back home in the Mitten State, I'm happy to do so.
We're very grateful for that, and my.
I not so much thinking about charters, but I mean, there've definitely been lots of state laws, and some of those have been changing recently. New Jersey had a state law that didn't allow, oversight agencies to do investigations or have subpoena power, and they're in the process of changing that state law. You've seen states go the other way. Tennessee, where they've had a long-standing civilian oversight agency in Knoxville, which had subpoena power. And then when Nashville, the community, organized and created the civilian oversight agency, the Republican state legislature decided to take away that power. And it was a big fight, and it kind of was a mixed battle. So it's more at the state level where I've seen there are things that are put in that, usually as protections for public safety or protections for privacy or something like that, that limit the amount of information oversight can get. I mean, someone else mentioned the charter in Dearborn, and it just a small thing, but it's interesting because that issue, it sounds like, as it was described, is what happened in Minneapolis when the majority of the city council went out and said, we are going to defund the Minneapolis police, and then they discovered, I think some of them may have actually known already, that the charter, it was in the city charter about the number of police based on the population of the city, I think. So there was a minimum police force size based on the population of Minneapolis. So you might want to look for things like that. But my guess is, again, long answer to come to, it's unlikely that there'd be something in charter specifically about civilian oversight, but there could be something potentially about privacy or access to information or personnel records. Just if you think about the kinds of things that an oversight agency would need access to, or even a board, if say it was staffed out of the mayor's office, there's no independent staffing, but you still would have to have the ability to review information, and not being able to review that could really limit the scope of the work of the board. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say, different people have different approaches. Generally, when oversight has come about, it has been through government action. I mean, so that could be a city council vote, right? So I think my advice is always, if you really want to do it, get all the stakeholders. And I mean, like all the stakeholders, get elected officials, get the law enforcement agency, and they might not always agree, they may be difficult, but you want them in the room. It's better to have the conversations and arguments at the front end than you'd get something passed by council and then it gets attacked, because I've seen that happen as well. Certainly community groups, different ethnic groups in the community. I mean, you want to get a good group of people who are working together to figure out what you want. And I mean, that's a big part of what NACOLE does as an organization. I will say that NACOLE is a little bit stretched right now because the last year and a half, so many communities have started oversight. And as a board member, I mean, I do this and try to help out as much as I can. But last week I did a training for the South Bend City Council and someplace else. I can't remember. Oh, Madison. No, I don't even remember. But I mean, we're doing this all the time. We've been working with Charlottesville, Virginia, to help them establish a civilian review board. Madison, Wisconsin, over the last couple of years, as they did some research, and then when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, they had kind of had everything ready to go, and so they went through the process, got the drafted ordinance, got it approved by the council, and again, they had city councilors who were working on that along the way. But it was a combination of activists and city council. So I'd say, to actually make it happen, generally what's most effective is having people in government who support it, who are taking the lead in partnership with community people, and constantly working with all the stakeholders at the table.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent question to end on, because I think it's a great way to, put in some concrete steps forward for us. So again, thank you so much, Brian, for talking with us. I am so excited that you came. And yeah, I can't express enough gratitude. And thank you for everyone who came and participated and asked questions.
No, absolutely. And, I know that AFD has been in touch with NACOLE for a long time before I appeared on the scene. So, just know, I said, we're a little overwhelmed these days, but we are a resource, and we are so excited about any community that's interested in creating oversight. And like I said, personally, growing up in Detroit, I would love to see Dearborn be another city in our country that's got civilian oversight of its law enforcement. So I'm happy to help.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're happy to work together.